going back, it goes backwards, this one. Okay, everybody, good afternoon. I'm going to talk about something completely different, which may be a good thing or maybe a bad thing. You can decide. Okay, so I'm not talking about methodology or theory or anything like that. I want to talk about something very unusual, which is the English language. Wow. Who would want to talk about that? Really, that's a very unusual topic. So using language history and etymologies in language teaching. And the reason I want to talk about this is because of strange things like this. See this photo? You will recognize this as the wonderful Eiffel Tower. And you might think to yourself, what has the Eiffel Tower got to do with the teaching of English or the learning of English? Well, it's a good question. I have no idea. But this is a very common photo in the textbooks that are being produced for English language teaching. And usually the lesson is about, let's tell a story about a wonderful weekend we had in Paris. And let's write about where we will go in Paris and what we will do and blah, blah, blah. And I think, okay, fine, but what's this got to do with English? I mean, at least do a picture of London or New York or Vancouver or something interesting. Anyway, so I wanted to look at linking the language itself with storytelling. Mario Rinvolucri's quote here is very famous, that storytelling is a very powerful linguistic and psychological technique. And it means either the teacher tells stories as the kind of linguistic input, or the teacher involves the students in retelling, understanding, researching, and retelling stories to give them a way of expressing something meaningful about a topic that they find interesting and stimulating. And I wanted to look at the different stories around the English language. And if you look at the list here, there's a traditional story. You can tell the traditional story of where English comes from, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, Shakespeare, blah, blah, blah. Nothing wrong with that. That's a traditional story. And we'll look at a couple of examples of that. And each one of these subtopics is a little story that students could learn about and talk about and find some connection to their understanding of English and their learning about how English fits with the rest of the world, because we also want people to feel that English is part of their world and the bigger world of humanity that we're all in. But I'm very interested personally, because it's all been my special subject, in the deeper story. So where does English really come from? Where did Anglo-Saxon come from? It came from the Germanic languages. Where did the Germanic languages come from? It comes from Indo-European. But where did Indo-European come from? Where does human language come from? Let's be curious. Let's find out about this, and let's see what kind of stories we can get out of this that would be motivating for some students. Obviously not for beginners, no, but for intermediate upwards, and especially for those challenging students you might have, especially at university, who are at B1, B2, C1 levels, and they've done the Eiffel Tower 10 times. So you need to have some new topics for them. And the third type of story is the stories of the words themselves, word stories, etymologies. So let's start in Anatolia, the best place to start for learning the English language. So 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago, a woman in Anatolia, a Hittite woman, is sitting by the river talking to her children. And she's teaching them the numbers, the words for the numbers. And she counts 1, 2, 3. But in ancient Hittite, not in English. And ancient Hittite, you can see it on the screen. It's, I can't read it from here, andosterias, which is 1, 2, 3 in ancient Hittite, which is the same word as 1, 2, and 3, because they are related over 4,000 years of history. Hittite is an Indo-European language, and we'll show later how it got to be in Anatolia. And she also uses other words to practice their language. Quis, who is that? Quit, what is that? Water, this is water. Can you recognize the word? Yeah, because it's Indo-European. Quis, quit, it's the same in Latin. It's almost the same word in Latin and in French. Slightly changed phonologically. And the bottom, she points to their group and says, Wes, ca, we are here. We, Wes, ca, here. If you know Spanish, acá means here. These words have not changed very much in 4,000 years. This is where English comes from. And this diagram, I don't recommend that you use this. This is for you because you're the super smart ones. But this shows the diagram of the Indo-European languages, and marked in yellow on the left, English, on the right-hand side, Hittite. And it shows you how these languages hold together. I've got a simpler example. I haven't got time to show you, but it's in the PowerPoint, which you can download from my website after the talk is over. And there's a simpler chart you can use for students. You can get them to explain the relationship between different languages in a very simple way: Germanic, Celtic, Italic, Indian, Armenian, etc., which is very motivating for students who come from any one of those countries. Now, to illustrate this in a different way, take this chart. In the middle, in the green, you see the Proto-Indo-European word quetwores. If I were to say this to you without context, you would not understand it. But look very quickly at the other words that come from that, and you instantly see the connection. Quator in Latin, Fedwir, the K becomes an F in Germanic, Ketwar in Baltic and Slavic. These are all of the words on this chart mean the number 4, every single one, but they all come from one original root, Quetor. This may be of interest to students who speak any of those languages. If you have multilingual groups, then they can find somewhere there that they can feel comfortable with and feel connected to. And that's what we want them to see. We want them to see English as a story to be told in the history of all world languages, in which their own language plays a part and which makes a connection between them and English on a different kind of basis. Now, we can put this in little charts like this. You could use some of this, maybe not too much detail, to get them excited. So look at the 4 columns here. I can hardly see them from there. I'm going to borrow Michael's computer because mine is misbehaving. So the first column is Proto-Indo-European, 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago. The next column is Germanic, 100 BC. The next is Old English. The next is Modern English. And look at the words. The first word is pronounced something like putter, which in Germanic becomes father, which becomes in Modern English father. So 5,000 years ago, father was putter. The next line, 5,000 years ago, daughter was Dochter. 5,000 years ago, guest was Gostis. You see the pattern. These words have not changed very much. Some have changed an awful lot, some not so much. This can be really interesting for students. You can get them to gap this. You can get them to try to match the old word with a new word and to gain some new knowledge about the history and the positioning of the language that they are in, depending on how much time you have and whether you do this as a 10-minute slot in a series of lessons, or you do 2 or 3 lessons for advanced students as a kind of project. Now, if you want and you have the time and you have interest in your students, you can go into deeper linguistic stories, right back to the beginning when we left Africa. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, left Africa around 50,000 years ago. We're all of us, everybody in this room, is from Ethiopia originally. We left Ethiopia, Kenya, around 50,000 years ago. We moved into the Middle East, and then we spread, as these arrows show you, we spread all over the world, taking a language with us. We have no idea what language they spoke, but they did speak a language. We know that they are physically the same people. And about 12,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended. The ice that covered the whole of Europe ended. And people who had survived lived in Ukraine, southern Ukraine, and Iberia, the Basque country. They're the only people who lived in Europe because it was too cold. And they spoke languages. We don't know what languages they spoke, but 10,000 years ago, somebody spoke those languages. Probably Basque is the descendant of those languages, not English so much, but definitely Basque. So that's a story that you can tell. Just having the map, you can get the students to retell that story, maybe find out a little bit about it. Very good uses of the past tense, narrative skills, and so on. Some students would find that really interesting. To get closer to modern English, let's look at this map of the Caucasus. in 6000 BC. You see the Black Sea on the left, the Caspian Sea on the right, and you see the little yellow stripe in the middle? That, ladies and gentlemen, is your home. That's where the language comes from. That's where most of you come from. The Proto-Indo-Europeans lived in that little slice of the Caucasus Mountains about 6000 BC, about 8,000 years ago. They had originally come from Africa and the Middle East, bringing some language with them, we don't know. But by the time they get to this place, they are starting to speak the language out of which English has grown. So some English words were spoken in that little yellow stripe in the Caucasus. 2,000 years later, 4,000 BC, 6,000 years ago, our people, our linguistic people, had spread across the whole of that yellow area. Can you see? So north of the Black Sea in Ukraine, across the Caucasus, to the right above the Caspian Sea as well. And that was a fascinating, exciting group of people called the Yamnaya, who were horse herders, pastoralists who rode horses, moved from place to place. They had the wheel, they developed chariots. They were the first people to fight on horseback and to domesticate horses, and they traded with everybody. And they had the Indo-European language, which they then, in 4000 BC, they all spoke approximately the same language before it started to split up. And interestingly, most of those people there carried the same DNA. We have their skeletons. We have hundreds of their skeletons, which we have analyzed. They carried the same DNA, and most of the men living in northern and northwestern Europe and Britain today have the same DNA. I have the same DNA, the male chromosome, as those guys there. I've tested it. I can't ride a horse, sadly, not very helpful. And then 1,000 years later, these guys spread. They were amazing people. They spread south into Anatolia. That's where they started to speak Hittite. They spread east to go towards Iran and India. That's why the Indian languages are related to English. They went, can you see there's one northwestern spread there? They went up the Dnieper River, up towards what is now Belarus and the Baltic states. That's where the Baltic language comes from. That's where the Slavic language comes from. That big yellow thing in the middle going north, that's the Slavic language. To the west, they went down the Danube and a couple of other rivers, and that became the Celtic and the Italic and the Germanic languages. About 3,000 years ago, they split into these little groups. So there's a wonderful story to be told if you want to motivate your students to do that kind of thing. And to make it a bit easier, this is the same map, but showing the actual languages, the modern languages. They're abbreviated, but I'm sure you can read that. It shows how PIE in the middle, Proto-Indo-European, moved towards Baltic, Germanic, Celtic, down south towards Greek, and also into the Anatolian languages, and to the right, the Iranian language, the orange bubble on the bottom right, and then the Indian languages. All of them came from one group of people speaking exactly the same language, using the same words. And that's where, my friends, English comes from. Some of the tasks and activities we can use, we can get them to Google the Yamnaya, get them to find out some of the cultural aspects of this original group of English language speakers or pre-English speakers, some speaking, listening, writing, reading tasks, some suggestions there. Get them into telling the stories. There are also some little activity sheets. You can download these from my website, little short texts with comprehension checking and vocabulary matching and little tasks. And there's a couple of those as exemplars that you can download from the website. Going on to the next part, the final part of the history, the storytelling potential, is the actual words themselves. So we start with Anglo-Saxon. Look at all these words on the screen. Every single one of those is exactly the same word today as it was in the year 550. Some of them are spelt differently, but they're exactly the same word. And so, very large percentage is modern English. So what would be a great activity? Give those words without context to the students and get them to work out what the modern word is, and then get them to understand, my goodness, these words are so historical. We've had this for a long time. We can look at the Vikings, the influence of Old Norse, the language of the Vikings. And if you look at this chart, we have Anglo-Saxon on the left and Old Norse in the middle and modern English. It shows that many of our words did not come from Anglo-Saxon, but came from the Norwegians or the Danish, actually mostly Danish. Words like they, because the Anglo-Saxons had a different word. So in Anglo-Saxon, we didn't say they and them, we said he and him. Now, have you ever heard a native speaker or possibly somebody in a movie or maybe one of your students say a shortened form? So if I catch those criminals, I'll kill them. And you think that's a shortened form. Not a shortened form. It's the original Anglo-Saxon form. Because only the Vikings used the TH form and the Anglo-Saxons used the M form. So lots of other words there. If you know any German, you'll find some of these words very simple. The next bunch of people who came and interfered with the English language were the Normans, who came in 1066. We hate the Normans. They stole all of our land. They introduced the class system. That's because house prices in England are very high because of the Normans, 1066. They also introduced very posh vocabulary. Look at the chart here. The Old English, swine, meant a pig. But the French word, porc, became the standard word. And you can see all the pairs and groups of words sitting here. The poor people were the Anglo-Saxons, and they had the old word, and the rich people were the Normans, the French, they spoke French, and they had the very fancy word, the posh words. And it's still today, the difference between to live in a house and reside in a house is a status thing between the Anglo-Saxon word and the Norman French word. So that's an interesting story that you can tell or get students to retell with themselves as well. Coming closer to the modern day, you can involve them in Shakespeare. Here's some of the words that Shakespeare invented, which didn't exist before. And some words that, not words, but individual phrases that came from the very groundbreaking translation of the King James Bible in the medieval times. So again, you could do some matching exercises with this. You get them to try to guess who invented what and where these things came from. And it can be very, very rewarding and certainly more interesting than the Eiffel Tower. Finally, we look at how English has borrowed words. And I love this quote: "We don't just borrow words. On occasion, English has pursued other languages down alleyways to beat them unconscious and rifle their pockets for new vocabulary." We're very good at stealing words from other countries. Here are some of the loan words that we've stolen. From French, from Italian, from Spanish. I won't read them all out, but this leads to great activities. Get the students to try to work out which word comes from which language, get them to research a little bit what words English has taken from their own language, which they might find interesting. They may know that already, or they will certainly find it interesting. And get them to look at individual etymologies. This is a story in itself. Here's the story of magazine. It's from an Arabic word, kazana. The plural is magazin, magazin. Somebody will tell me the correct pronunciation of that. And it means storehouses. And the Italians borrowed it as magazzino, meaning a storehouse. The French borrowed it as magasin, meaning a storehouse. And the English borrowed it as magazine, meaning a storehouse. And then one man in 1731 published a publication which he called it a storehouse of interesting new stories, the Gentleman's Magazine. And the meaning was transferred from the storehouse to the concept of a publication. But this original word, original meaning of magazine still exists in modern English. Where? When do we use magazine meaning storage? When you put the bullets in the gun, the magazine of a gun is the storage, the storehouse of the bullets. Yeah, I'm a bit scared you know that. So there are millions of etymologies like this, which are stories in themselves that you can tell to students and get them to tell back to you and give them some activities. So what simple matching activities. So here's a list of languages and a list of words that was stolen from those languages. Let's try to match those up. I mean, some of them you will know already. Chocolate is from which language? There's a list of languages there. It's actually from Spanish, through Spanish from Nahuatl, which is a Mexican language. Okay. Lute, where's lute come from? Lute. Like bungalow, that's from Hindi. We stole that from Hindi. There's lots of words like that, and you can have really interesting matching exercises, because it's not just a passive thing they do in the class. Get them to Google it, get them to find out about it, get them to explain it, get them to write a few sentences about it to go into a little bit more detail. So that's a quick overview of how, by telling these stories about where English came from, you can build a love of language, build more awareness of the English language, hopefully motivate students to learn more and to understand things and the links to their own language. And I think the most important thing, the last one, build an understanding of our shared humanity, our shared language history, which I think will bring some of the students together in a more cultural way. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint or the worksheets, go to the website. There's a QR code there as well. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one question